Good afternoon. Welcome to this inspiring session of the modulyss talks. First of all, sorry for the delay. My name is Amandine. I'm your host for today's webinar. And for the people new to our sessions, with the modulyss talks, we are trying to inform and educate the experts in the industry. So we are trying to yeah, give information about some talks and topics that can be relevant for the designer and the architect. Today, the second webinar of green building practices, and we have Lucie here. Lucie will talk about innovations and technologies in green building practices. So Lucie focuses on circular economy, sustainability practices across all sectors and works for Cradle to Cradle Product Innovation Institute. So that's it for my part. I'll leave the word up to Lucie.
Thank you, Amandine, and hi, everyone. So today we're going to talk a bit more into green building practices. And I would like to put the circular economy in context. We talked about circular business practices, about enabling the circular economy, integrating circular products within buildings, within any types of products that we find right now in the economy. But there's this very striking number, I think, that we need to keep in mind and that we need to be aware of, is that our economy in 2023 was at 7.2% circular. And if we put it in context, compared to 5 years earlier, in 2018, the circular economy dropped. It went from 9.1 to 7.2% circular. So we are actually, in reality, becoming less and less circular while we are promoting and talking about circular strategies in our everyday lives. Well, maybe not in our everyday lives, but in a more repetitive basis. So where does this come from? Well, we are really in a traditional linear economy, actually, where we keep extracting more and more raw resources, so virgin natural resources that are available to us. And since the 1970s, you can see the trend has just been extremely rising. It's quite shocking. Even in the last couple of years, it just rose even more significantly. And what is even more shocking is that the productivity from the material productivity, so how much output we get out of these materials, is not rising. It's just stagnating. So we don't get more out of the material we have. We just keep using them and disposing of them. And if you look at other productivities, well, the material productivity is definitely the one that is the most striking, not evolving compared to labor, GHG, or energy productivities. So there's a huge need to transition to the circular economy. We want to go away from linear, where we extract virgin raw materials that we use to manufacture products that we use for a definite period of time and that we just dispose of them without really thinking about what to do with them afterwards. So we need to transition to a more circular business model, more circular strategies, a circular economy. When we think at the design phase already, how to integrate circular practices to enable to circulate that we have instead of them generating additional waste. And we're also talking a lot about how can we reduce our emissions, how can we reduce our environmental impacts. But what we should really be focusing on is to generate more positive impacts. So it's not sufficient anymore to reduce our impact. We just need to make more, to generate more, and to really work towards creating this positive impact, not only for the environment, but also for humans, for ourselves. And yeah, the industry figures from the built environment are also very shocking, but it's not new to you, I guess. 50% of overall raw materials are used for this industry, and a third of the overall global waste is also coming from that industry, without mentioning the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy consumption. So there's a huge need to rethink how we are treating materials in buildings. And the significant issue that at the moment is that we're not really aware of what we have in a building. So we don't know where the materials come from, what kind of toxic chemicals have been used in the process, what kind of intermediary products have been used also, and where are they located in the building. So we need to think about how to create an ID, so a digital, or for now spreadsheets, or however we can work towards having an idea for products and for materials, to make sure that we understand what is inside the products and how can we trace them over time, because most materials will have a very long lifespan. So how do we know in 50 years how it was made, where it was placed in the building, what was put to glue it or to bind it, or the components around. So there's a huge need for material passports. And we see many material passports flourishing at the moment. And the EU is trying to launch also a digital product passport in order to fulfill this need that we have in the markets to trace materials and have specific information that will be transferred. So there could be information about the material composition, but also the recycled content, for instance, that will be placed in a product, the renewable content, whether it comes from organic sources or not. Maybe there will be also an analytical testing that will be provided to ensure that there are no hazardous or toxic chemicals in the product. We also need to understand how to dismantle the product if it has several components, to be able to reintegrate the different components and circulate them in the right cycle, to reuse them, refurbish them, or upcycling them. By keeping in mind that upcycling is our target, we should not try to downgrade the materials that we have, but we want to generate additional value from the materials that we have, because we can't afford to lose more materials since we are very scarce in the actual amount of materials we have nowadays. And there's also all the due diligence compliance that's quite important to take in consideration. It's not only about what's in the product, but also how it has been made, and was it respecting the planetary boundaries? Was it respecting the amount of energy it could have been using to be manufactured, and water and other resources needed to process manufacture the product. So there's still a lot of doubts on what will be required on this digital product passport, and there is a significant need for standardization, because we need to make sure that we understand and the different data that have been collected, and to be able to compare them. You need standardized data. Otherwise, how do you make sure that you compare the right products between one another, to make sure that you find the most environmental friendly product for your building, for your project? So ISO is just releasing now a complete set of standards to regulate how do we talk about the circular economy, how do we assess circular strategies, and how do we document product circularity data sheets. So it's also very much linked to material passports to gather all this circularity information that will be linked to a product. And there's another issue with collecting data. It's the accuracy of the data that has been collected. So the EU part of the Green Deal launched by the European Commission, there is a willingness from the Commission to stop and ban greenwashing. they found out that 53% of all the environmental claims on the market were totally unfounded and misleading. So the consumer is totally lost. There's a lack of trust of what we can hear, what we can find around us. So companies are even transitioning to a different movement that is called greenwashing. So they don't even communicate anymore about their environmental achievements, which is quite scary, because if they're really trying to improve the way that they're making their products or reducing their emissions or the water use, why don't they communicate about it? So there's a need really to make sure that we can communicate about what we're doing the right way, and the Green Claims Directive will facilitate that and regulate how environmental labeling schemes are working in the way that they are verifying accurate claims, verifying environmental claims from companies, to make sure that the claims are justified, verified, and accurate and complete. Sometimes they're also just incomplete. So that's quite exciting. And there's the Cradle Certified certification that has a very holistic framework that can allow companies that are in different sectors, but the biggest sector that this certification works for is the built environment. And it provides a clear roadmap to help companies to integrate circular strategies with different steps, because changing completely the way companies make products, it's not over time. It's not, you can't do it in one day. So there are incremental steps that are provided to companies to follow to integrate more sustainable practices. And it doesn't only include circularity practices, but also these 5 important impact areas. And one of the most important is what is inside the product. So the material health part, the toxicity part. When we are looking at sourcing materials, we want to make sure that the materials have no hazardous chemicals and that are safe to be placed in a building. Because if they are contaminating other parts, other materials, or if they are just contaminated themselves, how can we circulate them? Well, we don't want to circulate more toxic chemicals. We have enough, I think, on the market. So very important is to first look at what's inside the product, and then we can assess the circularity. If there's a reduction of the amount of virgin materials that are in the product, and to integrate as much as possible as recycled materials to really fit the circular economy. And then to look at where the product will be integrated at its end of life, to make sure it circulates and doesn't end up in generating more waste. And certification also integrates other pillars and important sustainability topics, which we talk a lot about carbon emissions and reducing our carbon emissions. So it also integrates that aspects. Also looks at the renewable energy deployment within the whole supply chain. So not only on operations of the company, but also with all the partners that are manufacturing the products. Similarly, we look at the water and soil. So it's how much water has been used, how much fresh water has been used, and how much reused water has been used, and encouraging to reduce the dependency on fresh water. And also looking at the discharges in the environments, making sure that it won't harm biodiversity or our soils in turn. And the certification also considers the social aspects. So it's very important to also look at how the people are treated in the supply chain, but also simply to follow fair business practices, because sometimes we see that suppliers are not paid on time. And this is something that needs to be also very much taken in consideration. So it goes from checking how much energy the supply chain is using, all the way to how efficiently the employees are paid, how efficiently is the water used, etc. So it really takes a holistic approach, and it gives access to primary data that will enable companies to have accurate numbers to share and verified numbers to share to back up their claims. And there's also a circularity data report that is submitted, that is provided with the certification. So it allows companies to prove that they have a certain amount of circular sourcing, whether it's pre-consumer, post-consumer recycled content, and where does it come from. Also, if it has been tested, to make sure that it has no toxic chemicals in it. We look at the circular design, has been designed for maintenance, for repair, and most importantly, the cycling instructions. So how can we dismantle easily the different components and where to place these different components into the right infrastructure to make sure that they will be reintegrated instead of being wasted. And to give a bit more concept, also to give a bit more of a practical example of how we can enable buildings to be circular. Well, there's this very interesting project from the Flemish government, and they opened a tender for, well, to restore the two World Trade Center towers that they had in the north area in Brussels. And they asked for the applicants to integrate circular practices. They had some circular criteria in the tender, and the winning architects actually managed to go way beyond what the Flemish government could ever believe in, and they managed to integrate 95% of the materials that were in the previous towers into the new building by either preserving them, reusing them, or recycling them. And that's a very impressive number. And when we think about circular practices, we usually think of how much it will cost, the financial incentives. We really think that it will cost more if we integrate circular products, which can be the case, but it can also enable cost savings. And that's what happened with this project, because by reusing and upcycling the materials that were in the previous towers, they managed to reduce on demolition costs. So the circular economy can also improve, can also have financial incentives if you really think collaboratively, and how to reuse what we already have. And one of the criteria also from the winning company, Befimo, or the winning the architects that work on it, they integrated one of the aspects of integrating cradle-to-cradle certified products. So they wanted to also make sure that the products will be circular and they will be tested to be circular, not just said to be circular. So they wanted to have proofs that the products were actually really fitting this project. And they managed to reuse, to collect the old cement and to reuse the old concrete and to reuse it to make 30,000 tons of new circular concretes. So really interesting example, because it was never seen that so much concrete could be reused and reintegrated into such a project in such a scale. Also, they used old waterproofing membranes to make the building waterproof. So they integrated 50,000 meters of waterproofing systems. And they managed to integrate some circular doors. So they really tried to, for every single component pieces of the building materials that were integrated, how to have them as much as possible fitting with the circular economy. So to truly manage to reach this circular economy, to really manage to generate positive impacts, we need to all together work together collaboratively with researchers, academia, building owners, architects and designers, specifiers, even students. Everyone is to think all together to manage to generate such projects like the Zine project, and to and to work towards this greater future with our economy that would be slightly bit more circular. All right, so if there are any questions, please let me know.
Yes, thank you, Lucie, for this very interesting presentation. We have received some questions. The first question: if we have a material passport for materials used in a building, will the information carrier still exist after 50 years? Speed of digitalization has seen the disappearance of different data carriers, such as disk tapes and IT systems.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's what the European Union is trying to figure out with the digital product passport. They started with textile products and cosmetics because it's easier since they are a shorter use phase, and they launched an open tender also for companies and researchers to find a way to create these management systems and a digital platform that will allow this data to not be lost and also to be updated with time, and to enable traceability of all of these materials in the future. So that's still ongoing.
Okay, thank you. Next question: what about interior fittings and materials?
Interfittings in terms of
Yeah, in terms of green building practices and the innovation around that.
can I see the, yeah. Well, it is green fittings. Can you repeat just
Yeah, maybe the person who has asked the question can maybe ask a more detailed question. But we have received more questions. How are new materials improving the sustainability of construction projects? That's a question that came in separately, Lucie, so you cannot see it
okay,
in
that's why I can't read them. Yeah.
the. So, how are new materials improving the sustainability of construction projects? Is it an
Yeah.
advantage?
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely. It's the problem with all the materials that we have in the past is that we didn't have these regulations on what could be put inside the products inside these materials, and also the intermediary products, to make sure they could be fitting in the building. So now the new everything that is eco designs, following the design also directive, will need to be thinking about how can it be more modular, also maybe removed from a building without being completely scrapped out, how to easily dismantle them, and again making sure there's no toxic chemicals in it, because it's if we these amount of materials that we get from previous buildings, but they are all toxic, it's very difficult to reintegrate them. So we want as much as possible to reuse old materials that are safe, otherwise to transition to safer materials if they are new.
Okay, thank you. Another question: could you comment on the most challenging aspect of cradle to cradle certification passport or process?
The certification as such an amazing roadmap for companies to follow, but it takes time. You need to the issue, and which is unfortunately an issue with the circular economy as well, is that you need the right resources and the right people to work during collecting the data. You need to also engage with all your suppliers. So it's about also data sharing, and there are NDAs signed, obviously, for some specific information that can be shared from suppliers. But it's about embarking all your suppliers on the journey to also sign documents, share information, and then to take the time, because it's a lengthy process. It doesn't only take a couple of months, it takes several months. It's more 10, 18 months that it can take to really fulfill all these criteria and requirements.
Okay, maybe a question that is related to that. Is the cradle to cradle certification the only must to have certification to drive green building, or are there any other certifications at top in the mind of architects?
Well, Cradle to Cradle certified is certifying materials and products. So there are other standards that would look more at building levels. So DGNB, BREEAM, depending on which country you're located in. LEED and WELL are also important certifications. But the Cradle to Cradle certified certification is really focusing on the material itself and the product itself. And there's this roadmap to enable the circular economy. So it's probably the only certification that will consider assessing circularity aspects and criteria, having circularity criteria in its standard.
Okay, maybe one last question. Where can I find the more information about all the product passports?
Well, they are on the European Commission's on the European Parliament or Commission's websites. You can find more information. The digital product passports that they want to inaugurate and to launch at the EU level. It will take time, obviously, because once a directive is approved at the European level, then is approved, then it takes 2 years for member states to integrate it within their national laws, and they can slightly change the way that they perceive the law. So it might take longer. Let's think about 2027, 2028 for the first digital product passport to be launched, and probably not in the built environment. You will most likely start with textile products.
Okay.
And otherwise, yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I can also support if there are any questions on this development, as we are working the institute on this digital product passport for the EU.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Thank you very much for this talk. The recorded version, together with the answers on all the other questions, will be sent to you via email. And the next webinar is the last one about green building practices. It's with Naomi Sakamoto from Gensler, and she will give you more insights on real life examples of green building practices. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Amandine. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Bye bye.